The seeds of an empire, England before the world stage. Long before the world knew the name British Empire, there existed a land of green rolling hills, dense forests, and rugged coastlines, England. This was a place of tribal kingdoms, Celtic legends, and Viking invasions. For centuries, small kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria battled for survival, establishing a culture shaped by resilience, cunning, and ambition. England was not yet a unified power, but the foundations for something extraordinary were quietly forming. By the late Middle Ages, a powerful monarchy began to emerge. Kings and queens sought not only to consolidate their power at home but also to project influence beyond their shores. The monarchy was supported by a class of nobles, knights, and merchants who understood that wealth and prestige were increasingly tied to trade and exploration. In towns like London, Bristol, and Liverpool, commerce was booming, and the seeds of England's maritime future were being planted. Shipbuilding, navigation, and map-making became essential skills, as the English began to look beyond the familiar shores of Europe. The story of the British Empire truly begins with curiosity and courage. Inspired by tales of distant lands, merchants and explorers set sail into the unknown. Portugal and Spain had already started their overseas empires, and England, though smaller in size and resources, harbored ambitions just as bold. The English sought not only wealth but knowledge, new trade routes, and a place in the rapidly expanding world. These early voyages were dangerous. Storms, pirates, and uncharted waters claimed the lives of many, but those who returned brought back knowledge and ambition, fueling a vision that would one day span continents. Around 500 years ago, the discovery of the Americas changed everything. England was quick to recognize the opportunities presented by this new world. Colonies were established, trading posts built, and the English crown began to see the potential for a global empire. Unlike continental powers, England focused on maritime expansion, using its navy as both shield and sword. This naval tradition would become a defining characteristic of the British Empire, giving it the power to control seas, protect trade routes, and challenge rival nations across the globe. However, ambition was only part of the story. England's early encounters with foreign civilizations were a mix of curiosity, diplomacy, and sometimes violence. Explorers like John Cabot and later Sir Francis Drake ventured into uncharted waters, forging relationships with indigenous peoples while also asserting dominance when necessary. These interactions were complex. They involved trade, cultural exchange, and occasional conflict. The English were learning not only how to navigate the oceans but also how to navigate the human world beyond their shores, a skill that would serve them well in the centuries to come. Back home, the political landscape was evolving. The monarchy was becoming stronger, yet it faced challenges from parliament, merchants, and local nobility. This tension created a system of governance that, while often unstable, allowed for innovation and adaptability. England's rulers learned that to maintain power at home, they had to balance authority with diplomacy, a lesson that would later influence how they governed their far-flung colonies. The stage was set for a nation that would combine political cunning, military strength, and economic ambition into a force capable of shaping the world. By the 16th century, England was no longer a mere island nation, it was a rising maritime power. The introduction of advanced ship designs, Navigational tools like the compass and astrolabe, and detailed maps allowed explorers to venture farther than ever before. England's ports became bustling centers of trade and knowledge. Merchants returned from Asia, Africa, and the Americas with not only goods but also stories of distant cultures and opportunities. These accounts inspired further exploration, creating a cycle of curiosity and expansion that would propel England toward global dominance. Yet, the early empire was fragile. Voyages were expensive, dangerous, and uncertain. Rival European powers like Spain, Portugal, and France were well established and often hostile. England's explorers had to be bold, clever, and resilient to survive. Failure could mean ruin, but success promised glory, wealth, and influence. It was a high-stakes game, but one that England was increasingly prepared to play. By the dawn of the 17th century, the foundations of the British Empire were firmly laid. A powerful monarchy, a skilled navy, burgeoning trade networks, and a culture of exploration had combined to create the potential for something unprecedented. The world was vast, full of unknowns, opportunities, and challenges. England was ready to step onto the global stage, not as a small island kingdom but as the seat of a future empire that would one day touch every continent. And so, the story begins, not with conquest, but with curiosity, ambition, and the courage to cross the horizon. The British Empire, which would come to control a quarter of the world's land and population, had humble beginnings on the windswept shores of England, where a nation dared to dream beyond its borders. The age of exploration, sailing into the unknown. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, England's eyes were fixed on the horizon. The age of exploration was in full swing, and Europe was ablaze with curiosity, ambition, and rivalry. Portugal and Spain had claimed vast territories in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. England, smaller in resources but no less ambitious, was determined to stake its claim. The seeds planted by earlier monarchs and merchants were now blossoming into a nation ready to venture into the unknown. Exploration was not merely an adventurous pursuit, it was a calculated strategy. The English crown and wealthy investors knew that controlling trade routes, discovering new resources, and establishing colonies could bring immense wealth and influence. England's first significant voyages were daring, often perilous, and always uncertain. Ships were small by modern standards, navigational tools rudimentary, and knowledge of the seas incomplete. Storms, shipwrecks, and disease claimed countless lives. Yet each successful journey expanded England's understanding of the world and its place within it. One of the earliest English explorers to leave a mark was John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag. In 1497, Cabot crossed the Atlantic and reached the coast of what is now Canada, claiming the land for England. Though initial settlements were limited, Cabot's voyage marked the beginning of English claims in the New World. His journey inspired countless others to look westward, imagining the wealth and possibilities across the vast Atlantic Ocean. By the late 16th century, England's maritime ambitions intensified. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh embodied the daring spirit of the age. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was not only a feat of navigation but also a demonstration of England's growing naval power. Along the way, he plundered Spanish ships laden with treasure, returning home with riches that symbolized England's potential for global dominance. Raleigh, meanwhile, attempted to establish colonies in North America, most famously the ill-fated Roanoke settlement. Though early attempts faced failure, they provided valuable lessons that would inform future colonization efforts. Exploration brought England into contact with civilizations previously unknown to Europeans. In the Americas, indigenous communities had complex societies, languages, and trade networks. In Africa and Asia, England encountered established kingdoms, bustling ports, and intricate cultures. These interactions were often a mix of diplomacy, trade, and confrontation. English explorers and merchants were quick to learn that success depended not only on navigation and force but also on negotiation and understanding. Alliances were forged, treaties signed, and conflicts occasionally erupted, shaping the early patterns of imperial engagement. Back in England, the political and economic environment supported expansion. The monarchy provided charters to companies like the East India Company, granting them rights to trade and govern in foreign lands. Investors pooled resources to fund voyages, motivated by the promise of extraordinary profits. The spirit of enterprise was palpable. Merchants, nobles, and adventurers were united by a shared vision. England could compete with the great powers of Europe and carve its own empire across the globe. The English navy emerged as a critical instrument of imperial ambition. Shipbuilding advanced rapidly, producing vessels capable of long oceanic voyages and armed to protect trade and challenge rivals. Control of the seas became a central principle. England's ships patrolled waters from the North Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, asserting influence, protecting merchants, and challenging Spanish and Portuguese dominance. Naval strength would remain a defining feature of the British Empire for centuries to come. The early colonies reflected England's strategic priorities. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in what is now Virginia, became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The settlers faced enormous challenges: unfamiliar climates, hostile encounters, food shortages, and disease. Survival required ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. Over time, Jamestown and subsequent colonies became vital outposts for trade, resource extraction, and political influence, laying the foundation for England's expansion into the Americas. Simultaneously, England began to explore and establish trading posts in Asia and Africa. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, opened trade with India, securing spices, textiles, and other goods that were highly prized in Europe. In Africa, English merchants engaged in trade along the West African coast, acquiring gold, ivory, and sadly, participating in the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade, a dark chapter that would haunt the empire for centuries. These early economic activities created networks of commerce that connected continents, foreshadowing the global empire that England would become. By the mid-17th century, England was no longer merely a participant in exploration, it was an emerging imperial power. The combination of maritime skill, commercial ambition, political organization, and sheer determination positioned England to compete with larger and wealthier rivals. The English had learned that empire was not built overnight. It required patience, strategy, and the courage to navigate both the oceans and the complex web of human societies across the globe. Thus, the Age of Exploration laid the critical foundations for the British Empire. It was a time of bold voyages, daring adventurers, and the first tentative steps toward a global presence. England had begun to claim distant lands, establish colonies, and forge connections with unknown civilizations. These early experiences would inform the empire's strategies, triumphs, and failures for centuries to come. The dream of a world-spanning empire was no longer a distant ambition, it was beginning to take shape, one ship, one colony, and one discovery at a time. Rising power, conquest, rivalry, and wealth. By the 17th century, England had transformed from a small island kingdom into a formidable maritime power. Its early voyages had yielded knowledge, experience, and modest colonies, but the stage was set for a far more ambitious phase, one that would see England challenge the greatest empires of its time. Spain and Portugal, long dominant in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, were formidable rivals. France, too, was asserting itself in North America and the Caribbean. In this high-stakes game, England had to be clever, bold, and sometimes ruthless. The growing English navy was a central instrument of power. Ships were built not only for exploration but for combat, enabling England to protect its trade and challenge rivals. Naval engagements became defining moments in the empire's rise. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, for example, was more than a military victory, it was a symbolic turning point. England's triumph over one of the most powerful fleets in the world sent a message: the English were no longer mere observers in global affairs. They were contenders for supremacy on the seas. With naval power secured, England expanded its reach across the globe. In the Americas, colonies multiplied. Jamestown had survived its early trials and set an example for future settlements. Plymouth, Massachusetts, and other colonies were founded, attracting settlers seeking religious freedom, wealth, and new opportunities. These colonies were vital outposts for trade, agriculture, and the extraction of natural resources. Tobacco, sugar, and timber became the lifeblood of English commerce, connecting the New World to Europe and enriching investors, merchants, and the crown alike. Trade was not confined to the Americas. England aggressively pursued commerce in Asia, particularly India. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, established trading posts along the Indian coastline. Spices, silks, and later tea became central to English trade, and control of these commodities brought immense wealth. In Africa, English merchants engaged in gold and ivory trade, and tragically, also in the transatlantic slave trade, a grim reality that underpinned much of the empire's economic growth. These networks connected continents, creating the first truly global trading system centered on English influence. Rivalries with other European powers often turned violent. England frequently clashed with Spain over control of the Caribbean and parts of South America. French and Dutch interests in North America, India, and the Caribbean prompted repeated conflicts. Warships patrolled contested waters, colonies were fortified, and battles were fought both at sea and on land. The empire's success depended on its ability to navigate these rivalries, balancing diplomacy with military might. England learned early that empire was as much about strategy as it was about conquest. The 17th century also witnessed internal developments that strengthened England's global ambitions. The monarchy, while challenged at times by Parliament, provided charters and support for exploration and trade. Wealthy investors and merchants financed voyages, colonies, and trading companies. Scientific advances, including improved navigation, cartography, and shipbuilding, increased the efficiency and reach of English expeditions. England was not just building an empire, it was creating a system capable of sustaining and expanding it over centuries. However, expansion came at a human cost. Colonization often displaced indigenous peoples, disrupted societies, and introduced new diseases. Trade networks, especially the slave trade, caused immense suffering. England's pursuit of wealth and dominance reflected both the brilliance and the brutality of empire. Achievements in navigation, governance, and commerce coexisted with exploitation, inequality, and violence, a duality that would define the empire's history. By the early 18th century, the English Empire had taken shape as a truly global force. It held territories in the Americas, trading posts in Africa, and emerging influence in India and Southeast Asia. Its economy was booming, fueled by trade, colonies, and strategic control of critical sea routes. The crown, merchants, and investors profited enormously, and England's cultural and political influence began to spread. The empire's wealth allowed it to fund further exploration, fortify colonies, and build a navy capable of projecting power anywhere in the world. The empire's rise also prompted questions about governance and identity. How should distant colonies be managed? How could England maintain control over diverse populations across continents? These challenges would shape imperial policy for centuries. Early experiments in self-governance, trade monopolies, and military oversight laid the groundwork for the complex administration that would later characterize the British Empire at its height. By the mid-18th century, England had firmly established itself as a dominant global power. It was no longer merely competing for influence, it was shaping the world according to its ambitions. The combination of maritime prowess, economic strength, and strategic intelligence created an empire capable of extraordinary achievement. But alongside these successes were contradictions. The pursuit of wealth often came at the expense of humanity, and the expansion of power created tensions both abroad and at home. These dualities would continue to define the empire's story in the centuries to come. In summary, this era of rising power demonstrated the British Empire's unique capacity for ambition, innovation, and resilience. Through exploration, naval strength, and strategic trade, England laid the foundation for a global presence that would endure for centuries. Its rivalries with Spain, France, and other European powers honed its military and diplomatic skills, while its colonies and trading networks provided wealth and influence on an unprecedented scale. The empire was growing, its reach expanding, and its story only beginning. The world was taking notice, and England was poised to become a true global force. The empire ascends, industrial might and global expansion. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the British Empire was transforming into a global powerhouse. Its early colonies had survived, trade networks had flourished, and rivalries had been tested through fire and diplomacy. Yet the real turning point was the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s. This revolution in manufacturing, transport, and technology did more than change life at home. It accelerated the empire's global dominance. The Industrial Revolution introduced machines capable of producing goods faster and cheaper than ever before. Factories emerged across England, producing textiles, steel, and other commodities. Steam engines powered ships and trains, allowing faster transport of goods and people. England's economic power soared, and the empire's colonies became crucial suppliers of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. India, with its vast cotton production, Africa with timber and minerals, and the Caribbean with sugar, were all woven into the fabric of British economic might. The empire had entered an era where industrial strength and territorial control were inseparable. During this period, England expanded aggressively into Asia, Africa, and Australia. In India, the East India Company consolidated power through diplomacy and war, eventually controlling vast territories and becoming the de facto ruler. Cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras emerged as centers of British administration and commerce. Meanwhile, Africa saw the expansion of British influence along the coasts, often intertwined with trade networks and unfortunately the ongoing slave trade in earlier centuries. Australia became a new frontier, initially as a penal colony, then as a land of settlement, resources, and strategic advantage. Naval power remained central to Britain's strategy. Steam-powered ships patrolled oceans, connecting distant colonies to the metropole. Control of the seas allowed England to protect trade routes, suppress piracy, and maintain military superiority over rivals like France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Royal Navy became not only a symbol of national pride but the backbone of an empire that spanned every continent. The empire's cultural and political influence also expanded. British law, language, education, and religion were introduced in colonies, often blending with or replacing local systems. Missionaries, administrators, and settlers spread English customs, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond economic or military control. This cultural expansion, however, came with contradictions. While infrastructure, education, and governance improved in some regions, indigenous systems, traditions, and autonomy were frequently disrupted or suppressed. The empire's achievements were intertwined with exploitation and social upheaval, a pattern that would echo throughout its history. Trade remained the empire's lifeblood. British merchants dealt in spices, textiles, tea, and later industrial goods, while colonies provided raw materials essential for production. Wealth flowed not just to the crown but to a growing class of industrialists, merchants, and investors. Cities like London became financial hubs of the world, and the empire's economic reach connected continents in a network of commerce unparalleled in human history. Yet expansion brought conflict. The Napoleonic Wars, fought across Europe and beyond, challenged Britain's supremacy but ultimately reinforced it. The defeat of Napoleon solidified British naval dominance, allowing the empire to focus on expansion, trade, and administration without the constant threat of European invasion. In colonies, resistance occasionally flared, from tribal uprisings in Africa to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a complex struggle reflecting both local grievances and the broader dynamics of imperial control. The British response combined military force, political restructuring, and administrative reforms, reinforcing the empire's strength but also highlighting the tensions inherent in ruling distant lands. By the mid-19th century, the empire reached new heights. It controlled large parts of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. India was described as the jewel in the crown, a region of immense wealth, strategic importance, and cultural diversity. Africa offered resources and ports, Australia became a growing settler colony, and the Caribbean remained a center for trade. Globally, the British flag flew over 1/4 of the world's population and landmass, making the empire the largest in human history. Its influence touched politics, economy, culture, and science worldwide. The empire's achievements were staggering. British explorers charted unknown territories, scientists documented flora and fauna, and engineers built railways, ports, and telegraph lines connecting continents. Literature, art, and philosophy from Britain influenced societies around the globe. Yet these accomplishments were inseparable from the darker realities of empire: displacement, exploitation, economic inequality, and sometimes outright violence. The British Empire embodied both the heights of human ambition and the moral dilemmas of domination. By the late 19th century, the empire's global presence was virtually unrivaled. Competition with other European powers continued, but Britain's industrial strength, maritime supremacy, and strategic colonies provided a decisive advantage. The empire became not just a political and economic entity but a global system, interconnected, complex, and extraordinarily powerful. It shaped the modern world, influencing borders, trade, technology, and culture on a scale never seen before. As the 20th century approached, Britain faced new challenges: rising nationalist movements in colonies, industrial competition from Germany and the United States, and changing geopolitical landscapes. The empire, while still dominant, had entered a phase where maintaining control required careful diplomacy, military presence, and administrative skill. The seeds of future decline were already sown even as the empire basked in its peak. In conclusion, this era marked the apex of British power. Industrial innovation, naval dominance, colonial expansion, and global trade combined to make England the preeminent world power. Its empire touched every continent, influenced countless societies, and created wealth and culture on an unparalleled scale. Yet beneath the grandeur lay contradictions and tensions, inequalities, resistance, and moral dilemmas that foreshadowed the eventual challenges the empire would face. The British Empire had reached the height of its influence, but history would soon test its resilience and adaptability in ways that no one could yet imagine. Trials of a global empire, wars and the seeds of decline. As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire stood as the most extensive and influential empire the world had ever seen. From India to Africa, Australia to the Caribbean, its reach was unparalleled. Yet this dominance faced unprecedented challenges. The global landscape was changing rapidly, and the empire, though vast and wealthy, was not immune to the pressures of modernization, political upheaval, and emerging powers. The early 1900s brought both opportunity and tension. Industrial might had made Britain a global economic powerhouse, but other nations, particularly Germany and the United States, were rapidly catching up. Competition for markets, resources, and influence intensified. Within the empire, nationalist sentiments were beginning to stir. Educated elites in colonies like India, Egypt, and Ireland began demanding more autonomy, inspired by ideals of self-determination and the promise of modernization. While these movements were initially small, they foreshadowed the eventual unraveling of imperial control. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 was a turning point. The British Empire mobilized millions of soldiers from its colonies, India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa all contributed men and resources to the war effort. These soldiers fought valiantly on European battlefields, in the Middle East, and Africa, demonstrating both loyalty and the global reach of British power. However, the war came at a tremendous cost. Millions died, economies were strained, and infrastructure across Britain and the colonies suffered. The war exposed vulnerabilities in the empire, showing that controlling distant lands was becoming increasingly complex in a modern, industrialized world. Despite the devastation, Britain emerged victorious in 1918. The Treaty of Versailles and the redistribution of German and Ottoman territories temporarily expanded British influence, creating mandates in the Middle East such as Iraq and Palestine. Yet the war had sown seeds of change. Colonies that had fought for the empire began demanding recognition, rights, and autonomy. The ideals of self-governance and independence, which had been simmering for decades, now gained urgency. The British Empire was forced to confront the reality that loyalty alone could no longer secure compliance. The interwar period was marked by a mix of economic prosperity and hardship. The Great Depression of the 1930s impacted global trade, including the empire's vast economic networks. Colonial economies dependent on exports, sugar, cotton, tea, faced severe disruptions. Meanwhile, nationalist movements in India, led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, grew increasingly organized and assertive. Protests, civil disobedience, and demands for independence became central features of colonial life. Britain, while still militarily and economically powerful, was struggling to maintain the delicate balance of authority across diverse territories. Then came World War II, a conflict that would transform the empire forever. Britain, along with its allies, fought against the Axis powers in a war that spanned Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Once again, soldiers from colonies played crucial roles. Indian troops fought in Europe and Burma, African soldiers defended their homelands, and Australian and New Zealand forces engaged in the Pacific and North Africa. The war effort stretched Britain's resources to the limit. Cities were bombed, supply lines strained, and the economy was pushed to the brink. Victory in 1945 came at an immense cost, leaving Britain weakened even as it celebrated triumph. The aftermath of the war accelerated the empire's decline. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, shifting global power dynamics. Nationalist movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East intensified. India, long considered the jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947, a monumental moment signaling the beginning of the end of Britain's imperial era. Other colonies soon followed, inspired by India's success and demanding self-rule, autonomy, and recognition of their national identities. Economically, the empire faced similar pressures. Maintaining distant colonies was costly, and Britain's war debts were immense. Trade networks that had once flowed smoothly were disrupted by new global competitors. Industrial dominance was no longer assured, and reconstruction at home took precedence over imperial expansion. Politically, Britain had to navigate a world where former colonies were asserting themselves, sometimes peacefully through diplomacy, sometimes through struggle and rebellion. Culturally and socially, the empire's legacy became increasingly complex. British law, education, and institutions had shaped colonies for centuries, creating enduring influence. Yet the moral questions of imperialism, exploitation, displacement, and inequality were now widely scrutinized. Histories written from the perspective of colonies highlighted resistance, suffering, and the human cost of empire. The narrative of glory and achievement was tempered by the reality of oppression and conflict. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire, while still extensive, was clearly in transition. From the battlefields of Europe to the streets of Delhi, from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the ports of Africa, the forces of change were undeniable. The empire had achieved remarkable feats: global trade, cultural influence, scientific advancement, but it had also planted the seeds of its own transformation. Independence movements, economic pressures, and shifting global power structures were converging, signaling that the age of Britain's unquestioned supremacy was coming to an end. In summary, the 20th century tested the British Empire like never before. The world wars, economic challenges, and rising nationalism reshaped the world and Britain's role within it. While the empire had demonstrated extraordinary resilience and adaptability, these trials revealed the limits of even the greatest global power. By the century's midpoint, the British Empire was no longer the unchallenged dominion it had been. It was a complex, evolving system facing the inevitability of change. The story of its rise had been epic, and now the narrative of its decline was unfolding. The sunset of an empire, decolonization and a new world order. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire, once the largest the world had ever seen, was undergoing a profound transformation. The aftermath of World War II had left Britain economically strained and militarily stretched. The rising power of the United States and the Soviet Union shifted the balance of global influence, and nationalist movements across the colonies were gaining unstoppable momentum. The empire, long a symbol of unrivaled global dominance, was entering its twilight years. The process of decolonization began in Asia. India, often called the jewel in the crown, became the most symbolic case. Centuries of British rule had left a complex legacy of administration, law, education, and infrastructure, but also deep social and political tensions. Nationalist movements, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, combined non-violent resistance with political negotiation to demand independence. After years of civil disobedience, mass protests, and political pressure, Britain finally relinquished control in 1947, resulting in the creation of two independent nations, India and Pakistan. This monumental event not only reshaped the subcontinent but also signaled a new era for the empire worldwide. Following India, other Asian colonies moved swiftly toward independence. Burma gained sovereignty in 1948, and Malaya followed in the 1950s, while Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, became independent in 1948 as well. The post-war period also saw Britain attempting to balance decolonization with maintaining influence. While independence movements were often negotiated, conflicts arose when nationalist aspirations clashed with imperial interests. Cyprus, Kenya, and Malaya witnessed violent struggles, highlighting the complex and sometimes painful transition from colonial rule to self-governance. In Africa, the pace of decolonization accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s. Countries such as Ghana, 1957, and Nigeria, 1960, emerged from British rule, inspired both by nationalist movements and global pressure for self-determination. The process was uneven. Some colonies transitioned relatively peacefully, while others, like Kenya during the Mo uprising, experienced intense conflict. Economic considerations, Cold War geopolitics, and rising African nationalism combined to make British colonial control increasingly untenable. By the 1970s, most of Britain's African colonies had achieved independence, dramatically reshaping the geopolitical map. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other settler colonies followed a different trajectory. Rather than violent independence struggles, these regions gradually transitioned to self-governing dominions, retaining symbolic ties to Britain through the monarchy and shared institutions. This model helped Britain maintain a form of global influence even as formal colonial control ended, laying the groundwork for the modern Commonwealth of Nations. This organization sought to preserve cultural, economic, and political connections between Britain and its former colonies while recognizing their sovereignty. The economic realities of post-war Britain also accelerated the empire's dissolution. Maintaining overseas territories was increasingly expensive, especially as nationalist movements required military and administrative attention. The Marshall Plan and reconstruction of Europe demanded resources, leaving Britain less able to sustain traditional imperial control. International opinion, especially from the United States and the newly formed United Nations, also favored decolonization and self-determination, putting moral and diplomatic pressure on Britain to grant independence to its colonies. Culturally and socially, the end of empire had profound effects. Britain had long exported language, law, and institutions, creating enduring legacies in many former colonies. Yet the process of decolonization also forced Britain to confront the moral dimensions of empire. Debates about colonial exploitation, the slave trade, and governance practices became central to historical and political discourse. Former colonies, meanwhile, shaped their own identities, blending indigenous traditions with the legacies of British rule, and often reinterpreting history through their own lens. The transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth marked a new chapter in Britain's global role. No longer an empire of direct control, Britain now participated in a network of independent nations bound by shared history, language, and mutual cooperation. The Commonwealth emphasized diplomacy, economic partnership, cultural exchange, and shared governance ideals, providing a softer form of influence in a rapidly changing world. This evolution demonstrated Britain's adaptability, while the age of conquest and colonial domination had ended. Its ability to shape global relationships persisted in new forms. By the late 20th century, the British Empire as a political and territorial entity had largely dissolved. India, Pakistan, African nations, Caribbean territories, and Southeast Asian countries had achieved independence. Yet the empire's legacy endured. English language, legal systems, parliamentary governance, and educational frameworks remained influential worldwide. The transformation from empire to Commonwealth reflected not just a loss of territories but a redefinition of Britain's place in the world. a shift from absolute control to cooperative leadership and cultural influence. In essence, decolonization was both an end and a beginning. It closed the chapter on centuries of imperial expansion, conquest, and governance, but it also opened a new era of international relations, global partnerships, and national self-determination. For Britain, it meant redefining identity, strategy, and purpose in a post-imperial world. For former colonies, it was an opportunity to reclaim autonomy, rebuild societies, and shape their futures. The British Empire, once the largest the world had ever known, had entered history, not as a collapsing force, but as a legacy that would continue to influence the modern world in profound and unexpected ways. A nation transformed, modern Britain in a post-imperial world. By the late 20th century, Britain had emerged from the shadows of its once mighty empire. The vast territories that had stretched across continents were no longer under British rule, yet the nation's influence remained significant, not through conquest, but through culture, diplomacy, and global institutions. The challenge for Britain was to redefine its identity in a world where its traditional imperial power had waned, but its historical legacy continued to resonate. The post-war decade saw Britain grappling with both economic recovery and social transformation. The destruction wrought by World War II necessitated massive rebuilding efforts. Cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool were reconstructed, while new housing, transportation networks, and industries were developed. At the same time, Britain faced the challenge of transitioning from an industrial empire to a modern economy. The rise of service industries, finance, and technology signaled a shift away from the reliance on colonial resources that had once fueled national wealth. Politically, Britain navigated a new global landscape. Membership in international organizations such as the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Commonwealth of Nations allowed Britain to retain influence on the world stage, even without the territorial reach it once commanded. Diplomacy became a cornerstone of national power, emphasizing negotiation, coalition building, and soft power over traditional military dominance. Britain's ability to adapt politically ensured it remained a key player in global affairs. Culturally, the legacy of the British Empire manifested in profound ways. The English language became a global lingua franca, facilitating trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Literature, theater, and education from Britain influenced societies worldwide, from universities in India to schools in Africa and the Caribbean. British values, law, and parliamentary democracy provided frameworks that many former colonies adopted, adapted, or built upon. This cultural imprint demonstrated that the empire's influence extended far beyond politics or economics. It had shaped global society itself. Immigration and multiculturalism transformed Britain internally. Post-war migration from former colonies brought new cultures, languages, and perspectives to cities such as London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Glasgow. Communities from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa became integral parts of British society, enriching cuisine, music, art, and social life. These waves of migration also sparked debates about identity, integration, and national values, forcing Britain to reconsider what it meant to be British in a world no longer defined by empire. Britain also retained significant economic influence, even as colonial wealth waned. The City of London emerged as a global financial hub, handling international trade, investment, and banking. British companies operated worldwide, often in former colonies, creating a new form of economic engagement that relied on partnership rather than political control. Trade agreements, foreign investment, and international expertise allowed Britain to maintain global relevance despite the formal end of empire. The arts and media amplified Britain's cultural legacy. Literature, music, television, and film became globally influential, from Shakespeare to the Beatles, from BBC programming to British cinema. The soft power of culture often rivaled the influence of armies, shaping perceptions, values, and aspirations around the world. British education, too, remained a beacon. Institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, and the London School of Economics continued to attract students from every corner of the globe, maintaining Britain's intellectual influence. Yet Britain's post-imperial journey was not without challenges. Economic competition from emerging powers, the decline of traditional manufacturing, and internal social tensions required adaptability. Former colonies sometimes revisit imperial histories critically, highlighting injustices, exploitation, and conflicts that had occurred under British rule. Britain was compelled to confront its past honestly, balancing pride in achievement with acknowledgement of historical mistakes. This process of reflection became central to the nation's evolving identity. The Commonwealth of Nations symbolized a new vision of global connection. While independence had ended direct rule, former colonies remained linked to Britain through diplomacy, trade, shared culture, and mutual cooperation. This network of nations emphasized voluntary association, equality, and collaboration, marking a transformation from imperial hierarchy to partnership. The Commonwealth provided a platform for Britain to maintain influence while respecting the sovereignty of former colonies, reflecting the shift from power to diplomacy and dialogue. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had successfully reinvented itself. It was no longer the empire that controlled a quarter of the world, but it was a nation with deep historical, cultural, and economic impact globally. Its legacy could be seen in languages spoken, legal systems, political institutions, literature, science, and global connections. Britain's story illustrated the possibility of transformation, an empire giving way to a nation finding new relevance in a changed world. In conclusion, modern Britain demonstrates the enduring influence of history. Though the era of territorial conquest ended, Britain's power evolved into softer forms: culture, diplomacy, education, and economic engagement. The challenges of post-imperial identity, migration, and globalization have shaped contemporary Britain into a nation that balances tradition with modernity. Its global legacy, both admirable and controversial, remains a testament to the extraordinary history of the empire and the resilience of a nation learning to redefine itself in a world no longer ruled by colonies but connected by shared history, commerce, and culture. Legacy and lessons: Britain in the modern world. As the 21st century unfolds, the British Empire exists no longer as a political entity, yet its influence permeates the modern world in ways both subtle and profound. What was once a global force controlling a quarter of the planet's land and population has transformed into a historical legacy, a cultural phenomenon, and a complex moral and political lesson. Understanding this legacy requires examining not just the triumphs of empire but also the contradictions and consequences that continue to shape the world today. Economically, the empire created networks that facilitated global trade for centuries. The integration of colonies into supply chains, from India's cotton fields to the Caribbean sugar plantations, established patterns of commerce that modern globalization echoes. London remains a financial powerhouse, and former colonies often maintain strong trade and investment ties with Britain. The British pound, multinational corporations, and service industries continue to reflect the economic foundation laid during the empire's height, illustrating the long-term impact of centuries of global connectivity. Culturally, the empire's legacy is equally enduring. English is now a global lingua franca, spoken and studied across continents. Literature, theater, and media produced in Britain have influenced societies worldwide. Institutions such as universities, legal systems, and parliamentary structures were introduced across colonies and often adapted locally, blending indigenous traditions with British frameworks. The Commonwealth of Nations continues this cultural and diplomatic link, emphasizing cooperation, shared history, and mutual respect while fostering collaboration in education, sports, and governance. However, the empire's story is not solely one of achievement. Its expansion was often accompanied by displacement, exploitation, and violence. The transatlantic slave trade, suppression of uprisings, and imposition of foreign rule caused immense suffering. These actions left legacies of inequality, conflict, and trauma that are still felt in many parts of the world. Understanding the empire today requires acknowledging both its remarkable accomplishments and the human costs that accompanied them. This duality is central to historical analysis and contemporary discourse on empire. Politically, the British Empire shaped global institutions and international norms. Concepts of governance, law, diplomacy, and global trade have roots in imperial administration. Yet the 20th century's decolonization revealed the limits of imperial power and the inevitability of change. Britain's transition from empire to a nation within a global community illustrates the importance of adaptation. Maintaining influence through culture, diplomacy, and cooperation rather than conquest demonstrates a model for soft power in a connected world. The empire's story also provides lessons in ambition, resilience, and the responsibilities of power. Its expansion required navigation of unknown oceans, engagement with diverse peoples, and strategic thinking across continents. Naval strength, economic foresight, and political innovation enabled Britain to project influence far beyond its geographic size. Yet, the eventual decline reminds us that empires, no matter how vast, are vulnerable to social change, nationalist movements, and global competition. The history of the British Empire is therefore both inspirational and cautionary, a testament to human achievement and a warning about overreaching moral compromise. In the modern era, Britain's global role has shifted from direct control to partnership. The Commonwealth exemplifies a new form of international engagement, a network of sovereign nations united by shared history, values, and goals. Britain contributes to global diplomacy, economic collaboration, humanitarian efforts, and cultural exchange. While no longer an empire, it remains a significant actor in world affairs, leveraging influence through relationships rather than territorial dominance. This evolution reflects a broader shift in international power structures, emphasizing cooperation and soft influence over conquest. Britain's historical impact is also reflected in education, science, and innovation. Scientific discoveries, technological advancements, and educational systems established during the empire's expansion continue to shape modern society. From advances in navigation and engineering to contributions in medicine and technology, the empire created infrastructures of knowledge and expertise that endure globally. Former colonies have adapted and built upon these foundations, producing leaders, scholars, and innovators who continue to influence the world stage. Socially, Britain today is a multicultural nation, deeply shaped by the legacy of empire. Migration from former colonies enriched its cities, cuisine, arts, and public life. Diversity is now central to Britain's national identity, reflecting both the opportunities and challenges of a post-imperial society. This transformation underscores the long-term social consequences of empire, highlighting the interconnectedness of history, culture, and contemporary identity. Finally, reflecting on the British Empire encourages a nuanced understanding of history. It was a story of exploration, ambition, and human achievement, yet also of exploitation, inequality, and conflict. It reshaped continents, influenced billions of lives, and left legacies, both positive and negative, that continue to resonate. For historians, policymakers, and citizens alike, the empire offers lessons about the exercise of power, the responsibilities of leadership, and the enduring importance of cultural, economic, and political interconnectedness. In conclusion, the British Empire's journey, from a small island kingdom to a global power and finally to a historical legacy, illustrates the complex interplay of ambition, innovation, conquest, and morality. Its influence remains evident in language, governance, culture, economics, and international relations. Britain's transformation from imperial dominion to modern nation demonstrates adaptability, resilience, and the enduring relevance of historical experience. The empire may no longer rule the world, but its stories, achievements, and lessons continue to shape the modern era, reminding us that history is never truly past. It is a living force that informs the present and inspires the future. The British Empire, in all its grandeur and contradiction, serves as a reminder of humanity's capacity for both greatness and folly. Its history is a mirror reflecting the heights of ambition and the depths of moral challenge, a story of discovery, power, and legacy. As Britain navigates the 21st century, it does so not as a conqueror but as a participant in a global community shaped by the very empire that once spanned the globe. And in understanding this history, we glimpse not only the past but the ongoing possibilities of influence, responsibility, and connection in a world forever changed by Britain's extraordinary journey. The complete history of the British Empire, from England to the modern world. Introduction: Seeds of an Empire. Long before the world knew the name British Empire, there existed a land of green rolling hills, dense forests, and rugged coastlines, England. Small kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria battled for survival, shaping a culture defined by resilience and ambition. By the late Middle Ages, a powerful monarchy began to emerge, supported by nobles, merchants, and explorers who understood that wealth and prestige were increasingly tied to trade and navigation. England, though small, nurtured seeds of maritime power that would eventually change the world. The Age of Exploration. The discovery of the Americas around 500 years ago ignited England's ambitions. Explorers like John Cabot and Sir Francis Drake ventured into uncharted waters, claiming lands, forging trade relations, and sometimes confronting rival powers. Colonies like Jamestown were established in North America, and the East India Company opened trade with India. Naval power became central. England's ships protected trade routes, challenged rivals, and allowed the nation to project influence globally. England's engagement with unknown civilizations was a mix of diplomacy, trade, and conflict, shaping the early patterns of empire building. Rising power and wealth. The 17th and early 18th centuries saw England challenge Spain, Portugal, and France for global influence. Naval victories, such as the defeat of the Spanish Armada, cemented England's maritime supremacy. Colonies provided raw materials like tobacco, sugar, and cotton, fueling commerce and enriching the crown, merchants, and investors. Trade networks expanded to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, while conflicts with rival European powers honed England's military and diplomatic skills. By the mid-18th century, England had become a formidable global power, with a growing economy and colonies spanning continents. Industrial Revolution and global expansion. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into an industrial and economic powerhouse. Factories, steam engines, and railways allowed mass production and faster transport. Colonies became vital sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, especially India, Africa, and Australia. The British Navy, now powered by steam, maintained dominance over oceans. Globally, Britain exerted influence through trade, culture, and governance. Yet expansion brought conflicts, uprisings, and moral dilemmas, reflecting both the brilliance and the brutality of empire. By the 19th century, Britain controlled vast territories and influenced politics, economy, and culture worldwide. The 20th century, wars and decline. World War I tested the empire, mobilizing soldiers and resources from colonies across the globe. The war's devastation strained Britain economically and socially, while raising questions about colonial loyalty and governance. Between the wars, nationalist movements gained momentum, with India, Ireland, and other colonies demanding autonomy. World War II further challenged Britain's supremacy. Colonies contributed massively, but the war weakened Britain financially and militarily. The post-war era saw accelerated decolonization, beginning with India in 1947, signaling the start of the empire's decline. Britain faced rising nationalism, economic competition, and shifting global power structures. Decolonization and the Commonwealth. The mid-20th century marked the unraveling of British colonial control. African nations gained independence, while Asian colonies followed, often after complex negotiations or struggles. Settler colonies like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand transitioned to self-governing dominions, retaining symbolic ties to Britain. The formation of the Commonwealth of Nations reflected a new model of influence, cooperation, cultural ties, and diplomatic engagement rather than territorial dominance. Britain adapted to these changes, balancing historical legacy with modern global responsibilities. Modern Britain and cultural legacy. In the post-imperial era, Britain redefined its role globally. The economy shifted towards services, finance, and technology, while London became a hub of international trade. Culturally, the English language, literature, law, and education systems remained influential worldwide. Immigration from former colonies reshaped British society, introducing multiculturalism and diversity. Diplomatically, Britain leveraged soft power, international organizations, and the Commonwealth to maintain global influence. The nation learned to navigate a world where historical legacy and contemporary relevance had to coexist. Legacy and lessons. Today, the British Empire exists only as a historical and cultural force, yet its impact is unmistakable. Global trade networks, political institutions, language, education, and culture all bear the mark of centuries of British influence. The Empire's story is dual: extraordinary achievements in exploration, governance, and culture, alongside exploitation, displacement, and moral challenges. The British experience offers lessons in ambition, resilience, governance, and the responsibilities of power. Modern Britain, no longer a conqueror but a participant in a global community, reflects the ongoing evolution of a nation shaped by its empire, demonstrating adaptability, influence, and the enduring legacy of history.